Is Metal Gear Solid V complete? The game itself sends mixed messages toward this question, with the inclusion of the 30% complete Kingdom of the Flies cutscene in the definitive version of the Phantom Pain. Coupled with the abrupt ending of this game's plot, this has led many players to blame Konami for stopping Kojima from finishing the masterpiece he was going to surely make if they had just let him. Speculation has filled the void which was left inside the game by its own design. But is the game complete? Kojima himself, along with other staff members of Kojima Productions at the time of the Phantom Pain's making, have all uniformly said that the game that was released was completely intended and there wasn't anything missing from the game that they weren't able to put in. When pressed about episode 51, Kenji Yano went into detail in one interview about that scenario's plot never being intended as an ending to the greater arc of events presented in the Phantom Pain, and if anything, Kingdom of the Flies was only ever meant to be an add-on DLC and not some eventual resolution to the game's chain of events. It's even left up in the air if episode 51's events are canon or not. So if that's the case, what gives? Is it all there or not? Many people are still confused about this game's story and how it could possibly be complete and intended, and how the Phantom Pain fits with the rest of Metal Gear Solid. Well, I've come to a conclusion in my own journey to answer this question, and so I'm going to share what I found here. Once I figured out how the Phantom Pain's plot operated on a mechanical level, I saw the whole thing works via a system of referencing events that have already happened. And then I saw this applies to all of Metal Gear Solid, and this unlocked a whole new way of seeing these games via these references and applying them to one combined interpretation of the narrative. It's like Kojima has built this secret encoded story into Metal Gear Solid and never gave us the cipher key for decoding it until the Phantom Pain, and even in that game it's not really given to us, it's only presented without further comment for us to detect ourselves. Taking the lessons learned from V to the rest of the series unlocks this encoded story, which is what I'll be doing in these next 5 videos. In other words, these videos aim to lay out a sort of web of references built between the Metal Gear Solid games and movies, books, music, TV, and more. And then I'll show how these influences point to hidden elements of each Metal Gear Solid game's scenario and details. Then what I do is a kind of reverse engineering where I extend those influences and their logic to other Metal Gear Solid games. By the end of these videos, these separate layers of interpretation all combine to form a complete image, which paints a surprisingly cohesive picture. This picture seems to have been intended from the start, but it was hidden from our view via symbols and subterfuge, and it was built in secret. Now I'll jump back in with these kinds of segments to explain things in a more down-to-earth fashion when things start to get too convoluted or swampy, or if I just feel like it. There are a lot of references and ideas coming up, so that's why I've made this split into multiple videos. I'll just have to start explaining the formulation, and then it'll take some time for me to lay out exactly how and why that is the way it is. Sort of like your first time through the Phantom Pain, your first time through this video might not make total sense. Now before you ask, I don't have any kind of hard evidence from any particular game that you've never seen before. It'll be up to you to take or leave what I'm laying out here in the end. In the absence of any better explanations, I have to believe this interpretation is it. Metal Gear Solid 4 makes perfect sense to me now, if that's any indication as to what this theory is capable of. My journey of discovering all the hidden parts of Metal Gear Solid V started about 5 years ago for me, well after the Phantom Pain's release, and it didn't really hit a crescendo until the past 3 years, but starting before I had released that first definitive MGSV explained video, putting forth the idea that Venom is actually Chico. If you enjoyed that video, hopefully you'll really enjoy what's coming up. With that said, let's get going.
Don't you die on me, damn it! He's dropping!
Intubate, now! Cardiac arrest, he's in VFib!
The deception of Metal Gear Solid V is one of the most vexing examples of a video game story as a meta-mystery, remaining mostly unsolved for these 7 years after its release. Here in this video and in the next videos in this series, I aim to shed more light on these games' hidden details and their labyrinthine plots than has ever been done before. There's a lot to cover, and in order to really get started, we need to first return to Camp Omega, where Ground Zeroes occurred in 1975. In the following videos, I will lay out a radical interpretation of these games' events, starting with Ground Zeroes and continuing into the other Metal Gear games. By the end of these videos, every single Metal Gear game will be recontextualized in some way due to the implications of what will be uncovered by this interpretation. This new perspective that I aim to lay out can be considered like a revenge on our own past, on Metal Gear's past. We're going to take back what we lost, what we believe was stolen from us. When I'm done, hopefully you'll see that our legacy was not stolen, and the answers were always right here the whole time just waiting on us to see them. Skullface is first introduced to us in the opening of Ground Zeroes, and it appears as if he's a new character who's come out of nowhere and inexplicably was always there during the past of Metal Gear. He even references himself being at Selino Yarsk, leading some to speculate that perhaps he was the guy in the helmet, directing Naked Snake's Halo jump into the jungle. In fact, Skullface at Camp Omega is Jack, Naked Snake. After finally accepting the title of Big Boss and Peace Walker, Jack takes the role of the black-clothed villain as a part of his plan to usurp Zero's control of Cypher in a mutiny that later becomes confidential and only exists in the official records via the effects of these redacted actions. This idea of Skullface simply defined is the role of the leader turned villain, much like how Snake is just a role, sort of a second skin. This role didn't start with Big Boss turning heel. Hot Coldman was essentially the Skullface before Skullface. Check out his costume. He's wearing black and gray business slacks and shirt and suspenders with a black tie. Imagine if he had donned a black vest, jacket, leather gloves, and a black cowboy hat. Skullface is an evolution of the villain role played by Hot Coldman. The leader turned villain trope is repeated throughout Metal Gear, like with Liquid, Solidus, and Ocelot. The character of Skullface comes from a combination of the original events in Ground Zeroes and a specific recontextualization of Jack's actions done after the fact. This kind of recontextualization is evocative of the way we remember events in our own lives, with certain embellishments and misperceptions added in, or perhaps with some parts left out. The idea of the past being controlled by the present is self-evident in the 1984 reference all over the Phantom Pain, and as I'll eventually get to, this idea is elaborated on Skullface himself with a reference made to Thomas Mann in a particular quote, which is a key to understanding what Skullface's real plan is. The real conflict behind the scenes in Peace Walker was between Naked Snake and Major Zero. Snake and Zero had been in a secret struggle for control of Cypher ever since 1964, and Jack used MSF and Kaz as a front to gather intelligence on the secretive organization. Unbeknownst to Big Boss, however, Zero was already fully aware of this mutiny and had a plan ready. Zero was already setting up a defense for Big Boss, knowing that he would have no chance to win facing Boss directly. Zero needed some way of making a trap that would ensnare and expose Big Boss. This trap was probably 10th Avenue in New York, the location Paz gives to Skullface during her torture. I'll go into this secret struggle more in a later part when I cover the deception behind the portable ops scenario, but for now let me throw this idea at you. Gene was just a cover identity used by Zero. So if Skullface at Ground Zeroes was Naked Snake, who's that guy with the face of Snake and Jack Bauer's voice that we're playing as? Well, that's Null, as he's known in Portable Ops. Null is actually Gray Fox. The unused Chico concept art for the Phantom Pain includes pictures of both Chico and Null here for this reason. Chico grows up to become Venom, then Gray Fox. Then after the timeline is complete, Fox takes a trip back in time and dons the identity of Null, and then sets to the work of recreating the conditions of his own creation. In Ground Zeroes, Fox is operating under the codename Snake and wearing the face of Naked Snake. Null is actually the medic and was there to start MSF with Snake and Kaz before the Peace Walker operation ensued, which makes sense considering the ending of Portable Ops where Null ends up joining Snake after he beats Gene and acquires the Philosopher's Legacy to found his army. Gene's army's heaven became Snake's Militaires Sans Frontières. Kaz and Naked Snake were working together during Peace Walker to get intel on the greater Cypher organization that Gene and company hailed from. It's likely that after the Zeke incident, Paz did not perish due to her having parasite powers. So Zeke's parts and Paz were then fished up by Kaz, Big Boss, and an XOF unit, who were probably his most loyal soldiers from MSF during Peace Walker. Skullface references his operational independence to Zero on their recorded phone call we can hear from the Phantom Pain, and this independence probably even went back to before 74. Big Boss had his secret unit that only took orders from him, and MSF was his cover for that unit's operations. Kaz likely knew of XOF, but he probably wasn't actually part of the unit and instead was only involved in MSF's operations. But this is why we hear Kaz on one tape of Paz's torture. That was likely the first tape that they recorded when Paz was retrieved and brought back to Camp Omega by the initial team. Boss and Kaz then hatched a plan to allow Boss to stay at Guantanamo and interrogate Paz further. In order to keep up this charade, Big Boss needed to be seen around MSF's base with Kaz while these secret interrogations take place so Cypher won't get wind of something being up. Thus the costume change for Big Boss, I reckon, and the scarred face. I'll go into it more later, but Naked Snake was probably created in a similar incident to what we see turning Chico into Venom Snake when he was just 12 or 13, so this scarred face might be for Big Boss an identity he crafted from his own childhood scars that he wore while he tortured Paz and Chico. So while Skullface was off torturing Chico and Paz for days in Cuba, the medic made himself look like Snake and took over the role with Kaz's cooperation. And one MSF soldier is there with Snake on the very first mission of Peace Walker if you're playing in co-op, as a reference to Null being part of the unit from the start. I just want to say that there's a striking lack of characterization for Gray Fox on the surface of the Metal Gear series. If you go by the official canon, he's only in 3 games and gets blown up twice before being squashed and forever leaving the series. How is this guy the best, but we never see him in Peace Walker or Ground Zeroes or The Phantom Pain? Wouldn't it make more sense if we actually did see him, only he was undercover, thus no reference to him could be made?
Boss was probably convinced that Zero had spies on his base beyond just Paz, and so I think Boss had Kaz leak Paz's survival to the rest of MSF when he went back to base in order to lure out any other Cypher spies towards Camp Omega. I think Boss expected someone from Cypher to come and try to rescue Paz, and as it turned out, Chico showed up. Chico was certainly not working for Zero at this point, and this meant Chico could not possibly confess to a crime he had no knowledge of. However, I think Boss simply couldn't believe that Chico wasn't part of some plan of Zero's, and this led Boss's Skullface to torture Chico and eventually implant him with the parasites and set him up to be killed by Paz's bomb. That bandage on Chico's head is covering the wound where the archaea was implanted on the mirrored side to Venom's horn due to the mirrored nature of Chico and Ground Zero's that I explained in my previous video. The wound in his chest is the other implantation site. Now there's another misperception about Ground Zeroes and the entire operation that I want to straighten out here before we go forward. Skullface and his XOF force never flew to MSF's base and attacked it. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba is over 800 miles from the coast of Nicaragua where Mother Base was located. In 1975, the real-life Black Hawk helicopter, upon which Metal Gear's Blackfoot helicopter is based, was brand new in US military operations, and that model is still in service today. With an extra fuel tank attachment, it can indeed make an 800-mile trip without refueling, as long as it's one way. XOF's choppers and Ground Zeroes don't have any extra fuel tanks attached to the side of the fuselage, as is available for long-range use, nor do they have refueling arms you see on the front of the choppers like the one Morpho has in the Phantom Pain. Since Skullface's choppers don't have the extra fuel tanks or any mid-air refueling attachments, their range would only be some 370 miles before they'd have to stop and refuel. Normally a long-range mission like this would be possible with naval and or airborne refueling mechanisms, so a chopper like XOF's would have to land on multiple intermediary points for refueling in both directions. It would be impossible for them to make it to MSF's base undetected on their own to launch the attack we see. And similarly, the Soviet chopper that Morpho is based on has a 300-mile range. So what does the game itself say about this inconsistency? Not a thing. Presumably, Morpho was actually ferried out most of the way from MSF's base to Cuba by a mobile landing pad disguised as a cargo ship, or perhaps multiple ships were used to get the chopper and its crew to and from Cuba. A boat could be used as a refueling and restocking point for Morpho to return to during the mission, and indeed after the mission's end, a ship or another set of them would also need to ferry or refuel the chopper to return across the 800 miles of sea, which would take some time, definitely several hours. Kaz does mention that it would take 16 hours to prep a bird when he's asked by Snake how long to get there, and that presumably includes time sailing Morpho and its crew to Cuba. There is an hours-long time gap that is skipped after we leave Camp Omega and arrive back at MSF's base during the attack, and the game never explicitly references this time gap during the story. Instead, we're shown some dialogue and drama happening inside Morpho to cover up the unexplained time gap. The editing suggests that it's a single uninterrupted flight from Camp Omega back to MSF's base, while obviously that's not possible. A note here, compare this theoretical ship ride I described to the one Venom takes with Ocelot when leaving Decoded for Afghanistan, and to the one in Metal Gear Solid 2 with the tanker ferrying Metal Gear in its belly. I'm suggesting Morpho was another example of this type of scenario. It might have been possible for a strike force of 4 or 6 choppers to utilize the boat-hopping strategy to attack MSF's base, but this also would require resources that were probably outside the grasp of Big Boss and his secret personal hit squad at the time. I think it's more likely that a separate attack force run by Ocelot was already stationed in range of Mother Base and they timed their attack to be done just before Morpho's arrival back home. Meanwhile, Skullface's choppers likely went to mainland America to go after the New York location he had gotten from Paz. Big Boss was intending to wrest control of the organization from Zero by force while he burned down the legacy that he probably saw as foisted upon him by the old man. It's likely that sending the poison pen to Zero's location was meant to prime Boss's target as a step in this bigger operation. With Zero bedridden, Boss would next infiltrate the hospital and assassinate him, just like we see Quiet reenact at Decoded. However, I don't think Zero was actually poisoned by this pen. Since Null had come back from the future, Zero would already have known that Big Boss intended to betray him. Given what I'm going to go into later regarding Zero's secret identities in Peace Walker and Portable Ops, it's clear that he knew Big Boss harbored a secret agenda from the start. Remember the post-credits conversation from Portable Ops where Ocelot mentions the perfect soldier data? That's probably the details of Null's past as a time traveler, and thus the potential future. What else could persuade Ocelot from using his half of the legacy to make a stand and instead cause him to cooperate with Zero during this whole scenario? This all means that the force that attacked MSF's base in 75 must have been Ocelot's own unit posing as XOF, with Ocelot directing it on site, not Big Boss himself. Who else would back Boss's move against Zero if not Ocelot? Think back to the hospital attack by XOF in Decoded, where we're led to believe Skullface is attacking it while no evidence of his presence exists. The idea that Skullface was behind Decoded was an idea planted in our minds when Code Talker and Ocelot and Kaz all tell us that Quiet was always somehow secretly working with Skullface, despite there being no actual evidence of that either. Decoded, like the MSF attack, was secretly run by Ocelot. Ocelot probably was involved with double-crossing Big Boss at his fall, assuming that Ocelot's loyalties are ultimately only to himself. Ocelot was probably Boss's XO after Miller during the mutiny. I'll dig more into this deception behind MSF's destruction later, but think for now that Big Boss's torture sessions with Paz and others at Guantanamo is probably where Ocelot first picked up his own taste for torture. Skullface's Western outfit could even be considered an inspiration for the future Ocelot's vest and spurs. Null would have already known about the hidden second bomb, since an identical scenario is what made him Fox in a past version of the timeline. He's not here to stop the bomb, but he does have a mission to stop Boss. I think the Ground Zero situation was rigged by Null so that he'd be distracting Miller while Chico would be on his knees next to the open door of the helicopter when Paz jumped out with the bomb still inside her, so that Chico had to make the split-second decision to jump or not all by himself. And of course, I think he always jumps after her. Null and Zero and whoever else stayed loyal likely had to let the bomb go off so Big Boss's plan appeared unhindered in order to not raise a suspicion before he falls into the trap at 10th Avenue. I went into detail in my previous video about the deception going on in the Morpho scenes were shown during Ground Zeroes, and how by comparing the recreations were shown in the Phantom Pain with the original, we can see that Chico's position was swapped with the medic. In fact, the medic was likely never there and serves as a phantom stand-in for Chico's own redacted actions. Since Snake is MSF's medic, and Chico is Chico, this extra medic must be a hallucination supported by his different appearances in Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain. To put it bluntly, the reason we're shown the scene of the player's avatar as medic in this false memory recalled by Venom at the end of the Phantom Pain's Truth mission is because Ishmael is giving Ahab the assignment at this point to become him, to grow up and leave his white whale hunting behind and make a legacy for himself. Ishmael is telling Ahab here to go back in time and become the medic himself and recreate his own origin as he has just done through code. This is the meaning of the lines, "Now do you remember who you are, what you were meant to do," that Venom first hears upon playing the tape immediately after remembering this scene. This shared legacy of Big Boss is both the legacy of Big Boss's title and of Fox's own self-creation and recontextualization communicated via doublespeak by Ishmael. This is why the sequence of images showing Venom in the mirror progresses from his small horn to his face bloodied to the large horn and demon face, and then back to a non-demon bloody face. These different images evoke the different parts of Venom's life. The past represented by the small horn, the present with the demon face, and the future with the mirror shattering. Symbolically, this represents us breaking the distorted image we're presented with by this game and seeing the truth, as indicated by the Diamond Dogs logo switching to an Outer Heaven logo at this point. Snake then walking into the blackness and mists represents us carving our own path through an unknown, uncertain future where it's up to us to determine what we see in these games in the end. This is why the mists and Venom himself recall Silent Hill. That game's world largely seems to operate by creating horrors out of the minds of the residents, and in this way we are now saddled with creating our own picture of Metal Gear. And sometimes those pictures can be horrific if we don't fully understand the underlying narrative. I'll go into it more later, but what probably actually happened was Snake and Miller were chatting in the corner about what to do next, and Chica was on the floor watching Pause. And then without a word she sat up, stood up, walked to the door, opened it, turned to Chico and probably smiled before she jumped. Chico must have thrown himself out of the compartment after her and ended up caught in the explosion. So therefore, this whole scenario of Chico and Paz being blown up was a secret self-setup from start to finish, meant not to kill them, but to transform them. Morpho is the place where the two of them become the Imago, where their inner images are realized externally via the eruption, morphing an act meant to destroy them into an act of self-creation and rebirth. Now, to fully explain what all happened to Chico and Paz when that bomb went off will take a lot of doing and a few movie references. And instead of going into that in depth here, let's just sum it up and say that when the explosion happened, the two underwent a radical transformation, leaving their child selves behind and becoming reborn as a full-grown adult pair, like caterpillars becoming full-grown adults bursting from their cocoons, all fueled by the bomb's explosive energy. Paz became quiet in that flash, and Chico became Venom Snake. And this wasn't even the first explosion that had transformed Paz, which I'll also explain more about later. You can see that Quiet reenacts Paz's jump from the chopper in the post-mission cutscenes during Cloaked in Silence. The other details of this scene reveal even more about what probably happened next. If you analyze the scene, it's never shown exactly how Venom gets out of Pequod himself and ends up on the deck to just casually walk into the middle of the ruckus Quiet's arrival causes. You can see that Pequod hasn't landed while Venom is here on the deck making peace. In other words, Venom's jump from the chopper is cut during this reenactment, which is a parallel to Chico's own jump being cut from the scenes we see in Ground Zeroes. Oh, and look who else is here. Ocelot has his own unit, and he's directing things during the reenactment, just like I'm saying he did before in 75. Chico was implanted with 2 parasites by Big Boss at Camp Omega. One in his head under the bandage, the archaea that was formed from combining Volgan's and Payne's parasites, and a second one in his heart, the diamond of Big Boss's own parasite, which is a pairing of Joy's and Fear's parasite strains. I think Chico was just trying to emulate Snake when he infiltrated the camp in his attempt to rescue Paz, and so Boss forcibly giving the boy his super soldier gene in the form of these parasites becomes a twisted take on the saying, "Be careful what you wish for." I put forth in my previous video that the parasites are just an evolved version of the nanomachines. The parasites mostly start doing their work after the host is wounded in some way, and they supplant the body's own self-healing mechanisms to replace the host with a parasite version of the structures being healed. This is present in the Phantom Pain's game mechanics, as you can see soldiers that are wounded and then Fultoned and saved will come out of sickbay with a boost to their stats. So these parasites and nanomachines are triggered by trauma, both physical and mental, in the body of their host, and then that host is remade as a better version of their old self. Upon being blown up, these implanted parasites in Chico would have mated to instantly reform and heal and replace and even transform his blown up and broken parts, creating the character we know as Venom Snake and granting him his unique set of powers via the combined DNA of the parasites. These parasites don't follow the normal laws of bodily physics that we expect, and I'll dive more into this as the discussion goes on, but the parasites have a tendency to create literalized versions of symbols out of their hosts, derived from the host's traumatic experience, and specifically the experience of death. Whatever mimetic image is in the mind of the dying host influences the parasite to add powers to this reborn parasite copy of their old self. There's a kind of zombie thing going on with this question of, is it still really the original Chico? Or is this parasite copy of Chico not really the original him? And of course, I think the answer is that Chico became Gray Fox in that metamorphosis. The boy did die in that explosion, but a man was born from the fire. Paz is a transformed version of the Joy, and the Joy and the rest of the Cobras were all originally created out of this same kind of metamorphic explosion via the parasites, which I'll detail in part 2. Quiet was created in the explosion from Paz having Joy and the Cobras as part of her transformed body's total DNA. It's also likely that since Chico was so close to the explosion, and considering the origin of the explosion inside Paz's body, her genetic material could have cross-contaminated and ended up in Chico's DNA for his own parasite's metamorphosis and granted him the powers of the entire Cobras as well. Remember the doctor talking about human bone and teeth fragments stuck in Venom's body? This is where his powers come from, especially Venom's rapid healing, as he has a kind of double dose of Joy's DNA in his parasite's lineage. Venom is like a child of the Cobra's combined DNA through his mother represented in Paz's body parts, and then the Volgin, Fear, Pain, and Joy parasites already inserted into his body by Big Boss, combined as a second DNA contribution as if Chico and Paz are the parents, and Venom is the resulting child. Quiet's entire body can disperse into dust and reform itself at will, indicating her powers go beyond the Joy's abilities, evoking comparisons to the Pain's ability to create and control hornets. Compare her blackened face during heightened emotional moments to Code Talker's own ability, and signs again point to the Pain's abilities. I'll dive way more into the topic of the parasites later on in part 2 of this discussion. What happened to Skullface after he left Camp Omega isn't directly told to us, and it appears as if he just drops off the map in 75 until we see the character appear again with an added Hamburglar mask in the mission Where Did the Bee Sleep During the Phantom Pain, probably in 86 or 87, leaving us to speculate what went on during that time gap. And why is he still dressed as if he's a jailer, complete with the keys he's seen sporting during Ground Zeroes? There are games other than Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain that can tell us what happened in this gap, via a comparison of parallels that exist throughout every Metal Gear scenario, and especially between the Metal Gear games released after Metal Gear Solid 4. The details of the Phantom Pain that seem to be without precedent can also give us a potential hint to the redacted parts of the past. Consider the idea of the V designation after the title of the Phantom Pain and Ground Zeroes. Kojima has a somewhat infamous tweet regarding this topic, saying that his thoughts on the matter are that it's MGSV, not MGS5. So why the distinction between V and 5? If V isn't 5, then what's 5? Originally, the game that became Peace Walker was designated Metal Gear Solid 5 by internal Konami documentation before they decided on dropping the 5 designation, allegedly due to the title releasing on a handheld and not a console. So then, does that mean Ground Zeroes is MGS6? And then the Phantom Pain is MGS7? That seems off. And it still doesn't answer the 5 question. Well, if you count the number of Metal Gear games released after Metal Gear Solid 4, you get 5. In fact, there were 5 Metal Gear games released over 9 years. Peace Walker, Rising Revengeance, Ground Zeroes, The Phantom Pain, and Survive. All 5 of these games are, collectively, to my way of seeing things, Metal Gear Solid 5, and were all conceived with cohesive, connective ideas in mind from their inception. Each one of these games informs the others, and indeed the rest of the series, via comparative parallels, which when taken all together forms its own story. And it's through comparing these games' stories to each other that we can start to fill in the gaps in each narrative, especially for the Phantom Pain and Ground Zeroes. For instance, compare Raiden on his bike in Revengeance to Ishmael on his bike in the Phantom Pain. Compare the time travel I'll describe Fox using with the time travel Chris undergoes in Survive. Blade Wolf and DD serve parallel roles to their Snakes. Compare 10th Avenue to World Marshal Headquarters and to Deucalia's Hospital. Compare Raiden to Venom, or Raiden to Eli, Huey to Good Luck, Chris to Chico, and Armstrong to Big Boss, Mistral and Quiet, Monsoon and Tretage, Sundowner and Code Talker. The links and parallels are almost too many to enumerate between these 5 games. So to answer the question about 5 and V, MGSV is 2 games. MGS5 is 5 games. There's also a character that can be considered a protagonist between the lines in all these scenarios, Gray Fox. Metal Gear Solid 5 tells us the story of his beginnings, most of his life's deeds, and how at the end of things, Fox is sent back in time, used as a vector to restart the timeline and create a new version of events. He's the delivery boy for a new version of events, just like how Solid Snake was the delivery vector for Fox Die. This time loop I'm about to describe is, to my way of viewing it, integral to the operation of Metal Gear Solid's stories and scenarios, from the first game in '98 all the way to V in 15 and beyond. Fox himself references when he meets Dave and Shadow Moses being back from a world where things like allies and enemies had lost meaning. Compare that line with the bleak survival the captain and other residents of D-Tay were left with in Metal Gear Survive. I'll discuss time travel in depth and how Fox makes his trip back and why time travel is integral to the workings of Metal Gear's timeline in parts 2 and 3 of this video series. For now though, it's worth briefly describing how Metal Gear's time travel mechanics work within its own universe to get a better picture of how this scenario is operating. The biggest rule in my mind is summed up by the phrase, "We can't go back." You can't change your own past. This is a core theme of Metal Gear, and it literally holds true for its time travel physics. You can travel back in time, but the trick is when you arrive in Metal Gear, you're actually creating a new divergent timeline at the time you arrive, meaning you're not in your own past changing things that already happened. You're in a new version of your past that you just created from your future's context. Your own past still exists from your perspective and remains unchanged. But your new reality isn't technically that same past. It's a new past. On a graph, the timeline would split like a V. Think of it like a New Game Plus. Any risk of erasing yourself like you see in Back to the Future isn't exactly the same concern, although it's still presumably still very possible to erase a new timeline's version of you in this formulation. But you don't have a situation possible where a person can just cease to exist due to changing the past. Their past still exists. It's just in a cut-off timeline once the change is made. On a meta level, I think the added word solid in the title of Metal Gear can also be considered to have a timeline identifier attached to it. In this way, I think Metal Gear 1 and 2's events are like the core timeline for these games, and then Metal Gear Solid represents one version or perhaps a set of versions of the timeline being rebooted by Fox's loops after the original events. Via this logic, I think we can say Snake's revenge happens in a spin-off timeline after Metal Gear 1's events and diverging from Metal Gear 2, and thus Rising Revengeance is also probably a spin-off from the same Snake's Revenge timeline, due to the word revenge in the title and supported by all the cyborg technology run amok in that version of events. The Rising title is like a reference to a different set of mainline events from the Solid version we're familiar with, and this idea of the titles being tied to the timeline versions also potentially explains the weirdness found in Metal Gear Acid's story, along with how Metal Gear Survive is cut off from the rest of the canon of Metal Gear, for example.
Look, I know there's a lot I'm not fully explaining here, but there's just only so much that can be explained at once. It's better to start here and say the stuff that doesn't make sense where it needs to be, and then I'll get to making sense of it all one thing at a time. That's mostly why I had to write this into a 5-video series. Metal Gear Solid is kinda dense. A lot happens in these games, y'all.
I can't say for certain exactly when Fox begins his cycle of recreating himself, but I'd assume he leaves in 2015, the final year for the series, and from there he goes back in time to some point in the early 1960s. Chica was born in 1962, so perhaps Fox can only travel as far back as 62. Some other time travel stories are known to use this restriction, and perhaps in Metal Gear, traveling back beyond your own birth risks undoing the circumstances that originally caused it. Since Null is said to be a child in the recent past of 1970 when he talks with Snake during the events of Portable Ops, 1962 could fit. 1962 would give Fox time to establish a cover as the boy Frank Hunter before eventually joining up with Gene's army. It's even possible that Fox was present at Snake Eater using the cover of Johnny Sasaki's father. The implication of all this is that there are always two Foxes. One older one who's come back from the future and is experiencing a new past, and a younger one who is always created during the events of the timeline and is fated to play a central role in what's to come. These two personas are first introduced to us in the intro of the Phantom Pain as Ahab and Ishmael. Ishmael is Null, and Ahab is Chico. The name Chico, meaning boy, is another role, like Snake, serving as a reference to this being the younger form of the future older fox. Compare this old fox to old Snake, for instance. And since they're the same person genetically, there are also comparisons to Liquid and Solid, or Solidus and Naked Snake. They aren't strictly clones, but they are the same, only their experiences differ. And where's the real big boss, you ask? Well, Fox is the real big boss. In order to become the real big boss, all you have to do is take the position and the title from the previous holder, just as Naked Snake did to the boss. It's just another role. When Big Boss went and attacked Zero in or after 75, he was probably met by Null somewhere above 10th Avenue, probably laying in the bed next to some decoy of Zero, and Null must have intercepted Big Boss there and sent him out the window. Compare what I've just described to Ishmael's actions against Quiet and Dekelia, sending her out the window while she burns. Compare this theoretical fight to the fight Raiden and Armstrong had in the end of their game, where Raiden shows up to a trap he doesn't see coming. There's the angle of the bystander's reaction to these happenings becoming public suddenly, and they fight atop this building-sized Metal Gear before falling to the ground while fire is all around. Some of Volgan's actions during the prologue also can fill in gaps, but Big Boss probably went on a rampage in New York City during this mutiny, and that could even be why the whole world wants him dead. A lot of Desperado's other actions are probably parallels to what Boss's unit does during this time. You can guess how the fight between Fox and Big Boss probably ends. Most of Fox's life before this fight is training in order to prepare him for this inevitable conflict that happens right in the middle of the timeline. If you go back over the tapes, you'll hear that Ishmael was in a coma for 2 years before he woke up, meaning that Null's coma is probably a result from his fight with the old Big Boss, not from the bomb in the helicopter. Many of the details of Null from Portable Ops line up with Fox. He's also the medic, one of the soldiers who formed MSF with Naked Snake after the events of San Geronimo, and he was always the best they had, the perfect soldier. So then, who's Skullface in the Phantom Pain, if Naked Snake is gone? Well, that's Ishmael. He's us. He's our mirror. Old Fox is testing young Fox. We're our own villain here. The future Fox puts his past self through all this psychological conditioning to prepare Chico for what's to come. This explains why Skullface seems like a projection of Venom. Ishmael is acting exactly like Venom's inner thoughts come to life because he can. He's already lived through these events and he knows what Venom is thinking in every moment, so he can play the perfect villain. Being our own enemy is appropriate because the biggest hurdle to coming to a sense of peace with the Phantom Pain's plot is one's own understanding. It takes a decent amount of work to get here, and this is probably why Kojima opted to omit a boss fight against Skullface. It's not appropriate to fight ourselves directly in-game during the story to stand in for accomplishing such understanding. The mystery is the real antagonist at the end of the Phantom Pain. Skullface is quite literally sacrificing himself to himself in the course of Phantom Pain's conflicts, in a striking parallel to Odin hanging himself and to Jesus' own crucifixion. This Ishmael was Ahab in his own past and had his own Null to his Chico in a previous version of the timeline, and so on going back. Altogether, this loop of self-creation can be thought to form a cosmic chain for Metal Gear's overarching universe. Two snakes creating themselves, as it were. Null becomes Skullface and willingly passes the title of Big Boss to Venom, but also the two share a period of co-authoring the Big Boss legacy before this happens. Symbolically speaking, this stands for how older players themselves pass down a tradition formed from playing and talking about Metal Gear to newer players, and how this tradition over time forms a chain of meta-story about Metal Gear apart from the game's narratives. In other words, there are the games, and then there's the story of the fans' experiences with the games, and Ishmael and Skullface both stand in for an aspect of that experience. Think of it this way. Skullface says he was there at Selino Yarsk. He was there to clean up any mess we made. Well, the dark side of Naked Snake that comes out when we get an alert and make a mess
is Skullface. It's a role we put on while we're a murder machine and we take it back off once the alert subsides. It's also like the demon, but that's just going to have to wait for another video. Skullface is the role taken on by the leader of Cypher when he gets his hands dirty, whether it's Zero as Hot Coldman, or Naked Snake during Ground Zeroes, or Ishmael in the Phantom Pain. The role is there as a post-hoc contextualization of the actor's script and performance, so to speak, and this also serves to give the organization of Cypher insulation from these later disavowed actions. So by willingly putting on this role of Skullface, Ishmael is choosing to play the bad guy, like how Big Boss had previously chosen to stand against Zero. But Fox recontextualizes his stand against Zero as a linguistic revenge on his own past in the form of the English vocal cord parasite strain. This linguistic revenge he inflicts is exactly the recontextualization of Metal Gear, Fox's own past, accomplished by the inscrutable story of the Phantom Pain and the unexplained changes present in the game's plot. These kinds of loose ends are littered throughout Metal Gear, and you might consider any of these instances of the games not making sense a symptom of this linguistic parasite. This is exactly why the English voice of Big Boss has changed in the Phantom Pain. Venom has the English strain, and thus he can't speak with the original English voice of Big Boss, David Hayter's voice. Fox is recontextualizing the role of Big Boss to differentiate Naked Snake's mutiny as part of Skullface's legacy, and so thematically this voice change makes sense. The change results in the spread of the disease, seeing as our memory of the old voice is what triggers our own Phantom Pain. The swap to Kiefer's voice is a metatextual commentary, given that Kiefer plays a character named Jack in a show titled 24, which is Chico's age in 1986 when he is reawakened as Venom. In other words, Big Boss's new voice is what infected the audience with this parasite, evident in all the confusion and misunderstanding. The bloated lungs are perhaps from all the shouting online. The voice of Kiefer is like another role that Fox puts on, a voice that he chose for his own reasons to define his legacy instead of using Hayter's inherited voice. The voice is specifically English because Fox blames Zero for his own existence, and Zero's mother tongue is English. Also, the American lingua franca is English, so there's another layer of meaning. The Americanization of Ricardo Libre becoming Frank Hunter is analogous to his own coming into a kind of freedom where he can define his own legacy apart from what he's inherited from his past in Zero, just as America once broke away from England. In the 7th season of the show 24, which first aired in 2009, Jack Bauer has to stop the use of a biological weapon, and the details of that story suggest 24 Season 7 being part of the inspiration for the Phantom Pain's depiction of the English vocal parasite. In the show, there are 2 separate canisters containing the bioweapon that Jack has to track down before a third strain is revealed in the end to be inside of Jack, as he was infected dealing with the other 2 earlier in the season. Jack even says the same line he tells Chico in Ground Zeroes while choking him out. "Don't fight it." He says this to both Renee Walker and Bill Buchanan when he chokes those characters out during 2 different episodes in that season. This missing third strain is a topic I could go into quite a bit. The use of 2 weapons and having a missing third instance of that weapon is referenced in the Phantom Pain's own narrative structure. There are 2 parts to the game, and then there's this missing third part where another story segment would seem to make sense, the fabled Chapter 3. Paz's 2 bombs can also be considered a prelude to this missing third bomb, and if you consider Death Stranding's narrative as connected to Metal Gear Solid V's, you could say that the bomb Higgs attempts to foist on Sam during that game, which the player has to huck into a tar lake, is this missing third bomb from Ground Zeroes. A narrative bomb is equivalent to a plot twist, and the missing third twist of the Phantom Pain is left up to the players to realize on their own in the end. The first twist was the one you got at the end of the Sahelanthropus mission when Skullface died. The second twist comes at the ending of the Truth mission when you find out you're not actually the original Big Boss. The missing third twist is accomplished by realizing how you are actually Big Boss. The spread of the disease is exactly analogous to the spread of the traumatic Phantom Pain of the audience's inability to accurately perceive this story at first due to its own obfuscation and heavy use of symbolism. We are the younger Venom, in this sense we are Chico, and only by finding a way to cure ourselves of the Phantom Pain are we able to begin to heal.
In a way, every sale of this game is like another person infected with the English parasite. This is what Skullface references with the line about linking lost hands and then being free. This video is that linking of lost hands. Think of me as Ishmael and these words as the cure, the digoxin shot to get you walking on your own legs on your journey. A lost hand typically symbolizes a missing experience in literature, perhaps most famously from the tale of Mice and Men. Skullface's entire speech to Venom in the Jeep is a self-fulfilling prophecy, telling us that we are missing some of the experience and it's up to us to fill those gaps. The events of the Phantom Pain are a series of recreations of the events of Ground Zeroes, Peace Walker, Virtuous Mission, Snake Eater, Portable Ops, and an as-yet unnamed scenario taking place during Snake's mutiny between 1975 and 1986. All of these recreations serve to recontextualize the original scenarios in different ways, thus suggesting the hidden details and connections. The landscape of Africa and Afghanistan both contain geographical analogs for referencing the layout of Camp Omega. Think of how Lufwa Valley recalls the jungles of Selena Yarsk. Compare the lightning-struck bridge at Dekelia to the bridge in Virtuous Mission, and also the same bridge in Lufwa Valley. The dramas that unfold here are symbolic of dramas that played out in the same symbolic locations in the past, and it's by studying these connections and the symbolism in the narrative that we can start to fill in the gaps present in the Phantom Pain and elsewhere. In Africa, the chopper's landing point south of Wala Yamasa is meant to recall the opening of Ground Zeroes and its cliff climb as you arrive in Africa during pitch dark. Wala Yamasa is a place where child soldiers are trained, and this area symbolically lines up with Camp Omega's Western Operations area, where tents presumably are used to hold prisoners while soldiers train nearby. Kaziba Camp, with its open-air prisoner cells to the east, can be considered like a stand-in for the abandoned part of the Cuban camp where Chico and the other prisoners were held in the same kind of metal open-air cells. Mafenda oil field covered in concrete and asphalt to the north serves as a parallel to the admin sector of Camp Omega. For Afghanistan, the symbolic locations for Camp Omega are again broken up into 3 exploded parts. The first part is Afghanistan Base Camp, standing in for the main camp and training area. The second part is Sarak Power Plant, serving as the analog to the abandoned prisoner cells with its own electrical cells and the cave in the back. And finally, OKB-0 stands in for the admin sector of Guantanamo. Think back to the Jeep ride with Skullface from OKB-0 over to the symbolic cells at Sarak. This is a recreation of the route Chico was taken on from the admin sector back to his cell after his torture at the hands of Skullface, reproduced in Afghanistan in symbolic form. Ishmael is a physical manifestation of Chico's trauma, and this allows Venom to process it, to begin to understand and heal from it. The original Big Boss probably rode back with Chico after Chico's torture and gave him this whole speech, and Ishmael recreates that speech as a part of this whole plan to recontextualize the already written past and help his younger self cope with his trauma inflicted by Naked Snake. The cave at Sarak, then, can be considered as like inside Chico's head. Compare the shape of the crack in the roof of the cave to the shape and location of Venom's archaea horn wound. The drama that plays out in that cave is analogous to emotional conflict happening inside of Chico. Skullface has control of Mantis at first in here. He has the strongest emotions, so here Fox's unconscious mind, the dark side, rules his actions. But when Eli is brought into the equation, when Fox remembers himself as a child, you could say, the power balance changes. Mantis bonds to Eli, and control is given to the symbolic inner child, and Skullface becomes flustered. This is a metaphor for Fox identifying his anger with his younger self, thus allowing his present self to finally let go of his ego-centered need for control. Consider how Eli is outside the cave, symbolically suggesting that Venom has thus externalized his inner child, and now it's more like a consequence for him to deal with, but not an internal motivation. There's an id-ego-superego interaction that can be superimposed on this drama, where Eli stands for the id, Skullface the ego, and Venom the superego. After being rid of Skullface, Venom lets go of his inner child too, when Eli floats off into the mist with Sahelanthropus later on. Consider Ocelot's interrogation of Eli before his escape as a kind of final therapy session for Chico.
The cave's metaphor of externalizing an internal mental process is repeated in Room 101, with Mantis and the giant robot once again rearing their symbolic heads. This reading is further enforced by the earlier scene Skullface and Huey recreate in the cave during the Hellbound mission. This is exactly the scene Coleman and Huey made during Peace Walker, while Huey was wheelchair bound and was thrown down the stairs. The word Sahelanthropus just means the man from Sahel, which to me is like a play on the phrase the man from hell. So the giant robot probably stands for Fox himself, and Mantis' control of the robot stands for which part of Fox is in control. Considering the Demon Snake appearance must be earned by the player's conduct, it makes sense that Venom Snake is a representation of Fox's superego. Superego is the part of personality that deals with morality, so this is why Venom's appearance reflects his conduct. Eli, the symbolic inner child, stands for the id, and Skullface the schemer is symbolically the ego. From this reading, we can see that once Fox identifies his trauma with his child self and Eli gets control, Skullface loses all ability to fight back. And indeed, an ego isn't really enough to conquer the desires and will of the id. That's why it's up to the player, Venom, the superego, the morality part of the self, to fight the id and get control back to stop Sahelanthropus from doing something that wouldn't be right. The ending of the game first appeared abrupt and without a guiding plotline after the death of Skullface, and that's precisely because Venom has lost his ego past that point, and then only has the work of conquering his symbolic id. And once that's done, there's nothing left. The story ends exactly when it makes sense to end from a psychological perspective. We are Big Boss now. The giant robot leaves, meaning Venom no longer needs to externalize these parts of himself represented by his ego and id. Those empty emotions we first felt upon seeing this story play out are analogous to letting go of the id and the ego and embracing the superego. Part of that is letting go of your image of yourself so that you can become yourself. This is about Chico letting go of his former life and choosing to embrace his new existence. And this recontextualization will give you another layer of meaning to add on to those feelings this game first gave you once you revisit it with all this in mind. This brings me to a general thesis statement about the Phantom Pain. No one is who they are. The catchphrase, "everything's a lie," from the garbage song used in promoting the game, was meant to be taken quite literally. We're not the original Big Boss. The truth of "we are Big Boss" must be earned, and the context has to be reached out and grasped before it's really true. So, allow me to quickly go over a partial list of who's playing who in the Phantom Pain before I go over it all in more detail. Skullface is being played by Null, aka Old Fox from the past future. Venom Snake is being played by Young Fox, created in this timeline, aka Chico. Kaz is Decoy Octopus. Quiet is Paws, and she's also Sniper Wolf. Code Talker is Vulcan Raven, and the Diamond Dog soldiers are the Genome Soldiers. And most people already know, Tretich is Psycho Mantis, and Eli is Liquid Snake. The entire cast of Shadow Moses' villains appear on Diamond Dog's mother base at some point during the Phantom Pain. But it doesn't stop there. It's almost certain that every other character we see in the Phantom Pain is someone we already know in disguise. Compare the bionics expert we rescue in Over the Fence to Dr. Madnar, the scientist who allegedly turned Big Boss into a cyborg after Outer Heaven. Compare those two to Kenneth Baker. These guys are all weapons tech designers, which makes me think they're all the same guy, and that's Sokolov. Huey is not himself either, since Hideo giving Huey his glasses after Huey loses his own could be a hint as to who Huey really is. Compare Huey's first pair of glasses to the glasses worn by the Doctor who wakes up Venom at Dekelia. Those two are probably the same guy, but maybe not the same as the Huey from Peace Walker. Consider how sunglasses are used in Metal Gear Solid as a disguise, and how the idea of wearing glasses could be code for wearing a disguise in every Metal Gear game. Huey is a key player in the design of the weapon to surpass Metal Gear in the Phantom Pain, and if that weapon is actually Fox himself, then it makes sense Huey in the Phantom Pain is probably Zero in disguise. Some of the other details about the game are obvious parallels to details from other games, but they've all had a name change and are hiding in plain sight. Battle Gear is a stand-in for the inoperative Metal Gear that Solid Snake destroys at the end of Metal Gear 1 in Outer Heaven. Compare Skullface's death to the boss's death. Compare the state Skullface's body is left in
to the state of Solidus when he's burned in the Volta in Metal Gear Solid 4. Discovering and untangling all these parallels yourself is something I hope you can have fun with, and I won't try to spoil all that fun here just yet.
Okay, well, that's the end of the first part of this video series. I know that was a lot, and I'm really just getting started. I can say the other videos should be easier to digest from here, and each of them should be a little shorter too. The stuff I said here that doesn't make sense yet will make sense when you finish the other videos, and that's part of why I split all these up to make rewatching specific parts a little quicker and easier. If it takes you a bit to wrap your head around this, welcome to the club. It's taken me the better part of a year just to write and edit this whole script. With all that said, once you're ready, go on to part 2, where I explain a lot more about the nanomachines and the parasites, and I speculate about how they originated and can make the supernatural real in Metal Gear's world.